Welcome to the Coach2Scale podcast. This week, we're breaking the mold with Jim Gannon, SVP of Sales at Sysdig, who's busting the myth that all salespeople are coin-operated. Now, Jim's all about making the ordinary extraordinary, whether it's customer success, building trust, or leading a team that's outsourced, outbranded, or outnumbered. He's got his team thinking like goats while proving that culture beats product and market fit all day long. Plus, Jim's sharing his funniest story of what not to do in customer meetings in Japan. Trust me, you don't want to miss this one. Love Jim's insights? Let's hear your take. Drop your favorite moments or your own leadership lessons in the comments on LinkedIn, and let's keep the conversation going. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel on YouTube for more game-changing episodes like this one. Join the Coach2Scale community, and let's level up our leadership game together. Let's go. Welcome to Coach2Scale, how modern leaders build coaching cultures. I'm your host, Matt Bonelli. Join me as we build a community of like-minded professionals who share the belief that effective coaching improves the performance of every team member. Our mission is to help leaders become better coaches. The Coach2Scale podcast is sponsored by Coachum, the world's first AI coaching execution platform that leverages evidence-based coaching to increase quota attainment. And with that, let's get started. This week's guest strives to make the ordinary extraordinary in all aspects of the game. He's done this at solid, well-known companies along the way like Pure Storage and Sumo Logic. Currently, he's SVP of Sales at Sysdig, as well as, very important here, fellow BC Eagle and rugby player, Jim Gannon. Welcome to Coach2Scale.
Hey, great to be with you today, Matt. Thank you much for having me on. Much appreciated.
Awesome. I think I may have asked you this. I know you didn't play the same position I did in rugby because you look like taller and leaner. So I was a hooker, right, in the middle there. What position did you play?
You know, I started at second row until a couple of guys joined the team who were big farm boys from the Midwest, and I quickly got pushed out to flanker. Thank goodness, because now my ears aren't swollen and crinkled. So I survived 4 years of rugby. You know, the nose might be a little bit bent, but otherwise made for an outstanding 4 years at BC.
Awesome. Go Eagles. All right. Jim, let's get right into it. You've been doing this for a long time, and I know you're the type of leader that puts your heart and soul into everything, and you have your ear to the ground. So you hear a lot, right? What's a myth about coaching and leading salespeople and sales teams that you believe is misguided or maybe even complete BS?
Great question. The one that makes me cringe is when I hear people say that, well, that's because, you know, your sales team is coin operated, you know, and it usually comes from business partners who don't know enough about the nuances of what's involved in selling. And the reason I think that's a misperception is because on the one hand, there was a study done. And the study came out and the results said that only 17% of sellers rank money as a top motivator, which I totally agree with. I mean, I'll be the first one to say that comp drives behavior, and we all pack in to come up with comp plans that will motivate the teams to get to the goals of the business. But in my experience, you know, salespeople love the autonomy to manage their own book of business. They love competing. They love winning. They love impacting the business and knowing how their results are taking the business forward. You know, they actually, a lot of them love coaching their peers. It's certainly humbling to have partners in the business say, hey, how did you secure that lead? How did you advance that deal? How did you get to the executive buyer? And there's a certain amount of pride that I think a lot of people bring to the table in selling capacities. And it's overlooked when people say that they're just coin operated.
You know, the how did you do this? How did you get that lead? How did you secure that appointment? Do you find that, it's kind of a weird question, but do you find that the people who are asking the how did you question the most tend to have better results, the curiosity factor?
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating topic because, you know, there's often people who pose the question to salespeople, are you results oriented or are you process oriented? And I find that those individuals that are intellectually curious are constantly benchmarking against their peers. They tend to gravitate to the folks who wind up at club every year.
Yeah.
And it's almost its own little club because they're all trying to figure out, how do I keep raising the bar and improving the way I do what I do? And I find that that is one thing that distinguishes, the top performers versus those who are middle of the pack.
And in that study, and maybe it's not the study, but I'm with you about a small percentage of people are driven purely by the Franklins, right? The Benjamins. And there's usually a lot more to it than that. But those people who are money motivated, this is your opinion. Do you think they're the more senior, experienced folks who can do this job? I don't want to say with their eyes closed, but they don't have to do this job anymore. They're just doing it because they get enjoyment from it. They're good at it, and they're just trying to make bank in the latter part of their career. Or do you find that it's that young buck who he or she thinks that they're supposed to say, I'm money motivated, that makes up that 17% in the study?
I think the individuals that figure out the formula to successfully selling, they appreciate the benefits that come with it, and it's a recognition of being put up on stage and being eligible to make a high performers club trip. And then, of course, there's the financial benefits that come with being in a leveraged comp plan and having commissions that afford a better quality of life. And I think that becomes habitual, and there's probably endorphins that kick in.
Mm-hmm.
And while those individuals love earning bank, they also love challenges and they love competing and figuring out, how do I take down a deal against a bigger branded, better resourced, well-known competitor? And I think that plays a big part in the psyche of those top performing athletes.
Yeah, no, so true. Jim, if you could delegate, and you probably maybe you do this well, but if you could delegate all the things that need to be done to somebody else who's part of your team that could do them as well or even better than you, and you can focus on the one aspect of the role that drives the most value, has the most impact, and is right in your wheelhouse. What is that? Can you describe what you're focusing mainly on as a sales leader?
I might not give you the answer you're looking for.
I'm looking for one.
I might say that there's two levers that I excel at and love pulling on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis. And the reason I bring this up is I had a conversation with one of our sales engineering managers about a month ago. And unexpectedly, I got some feedback. He said, look, I just want to share something, Jim. I don't say this very often, but you're one of the few leaders that balances inspirational leadership with creating a culture of accountability. And if you think about those two concepts, sometimes they may appear to provide friction, because if you're asking people to be operationally excellent, you're holding them up to a pretty high bar.
Yeah.
And that can frustrate people who don't want to have themselves under the harsh spotlight of accountability. But we all know that in order to execute a go-to-market motion, you have to do so many things well along the path to executing against your ICP, looking at the intent signals to buy, translating that into an outreach sequence that gets people to the phone, and then quickly being able to land follow-up meetings. And having that ability to motivate people while also hold them accountable to what's required to run a go-to-market business is something that takes, in my opinion, a concerted effort and a lot of experience. And by all means, I've made mistakes along the way, but you learn from all those mistakes.
And so, we certainly made mistakes. And I think that's really the focus with the Coach2Scale podcast, is to bring people who have interesting point of views, who've had success, but also who have made the mistakes along the way and are open to talking about them. When you talk about inspirational leadership and holding people accountable, let's dig into those two separately. Let's start with
Sure.
inspirational leadership. Why is that important to you? And what is a way that you execute upon that? How do you inspire and motivationally?
I think suffice to say, your listeners would probably empathize with this comment that they're all in a hyper competitive market.
Yeah.
That is a very difficult selling motion when you've got other people that may be better branded and they may have supply chain relationships, exec relationships,
Mm-hmm.
and being able to inspire your sales teams to go out without having perhaps the branding or even the competitive product, that requires a certain amount of finesse. And one of the things that I have done consistently, and I picked this up from someone a couple of years ago, is this concept of rewarding and recognizing, and I'm emphasizing the recognizing individuals on a weekly basis who are doing some of the activities and the behaviors that we hold near and dear to our heart. And I'll give you an example. Um, I was down at a lacrosse tournament recently in San Diego with my daughter.
Mm-hmm.
In these lacrosse tournaments, like every other big sport, you've got a massive area of food trucks and tents selling apparel. And there was this one company, and it's called GOAT. And, the GOAT acronym, greatest of all time, it's become a lifestyle and an apparel company. And all the kids like wearing these pictures of these cartoon goats. And now I bring this up because during one of my weekly notes to the team, and this gets to your point about how do you execute against this concept of inspirational leadership, I look for examples in my personal life that cross over to my professional life. And in this case, I shared this concept that the GOAT apparel company, which is really a lifestyle company, promotes the idea of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. And this goat happens to wear a crown. And this message or the narrative for the branding of the company is anybody can wear the crown. Now, I took that message, I delivered it to the team with a couple of pictures, and then I put up pictures of individuals that had closed deals during the week. And it wasn't just the sales team that I recognized. I had pictures of the sales engineer, the deal desk folks, and the onboarding team for professional services. It's a collective village that you need to earn the right to partner with somebody. And by putting their names and the details of their win in lights and sending it out to the global sales team, it allows me to reinforce how important it is to execute the way that they did. And I'll pick up 2 or 3 things that they did exceptionally well in the journey to closing the deal, why we won, what was our competitive differentiator. And by putting that note out on a week in and week out basis, I'm reinforcing the behaviors and the activities that we're looking for the teams to execute against. But I'm also trying to instill confidence that we have the ability to go out there and slay dragons and take down deals against better branded competitors if we can follow the motion that some of the other folks in the business are following. So that's a month. I do this every week. So every Sunday, I'm taking an hour out of the time with the family, and I'm just putting some recognition out there and putting pictures out there and telling a story.
And it's all, and you shared that with me after our first conversations, and I got a feel for it, and it's awesome. And there's a lot of things playing here. Umbrella comment. It's what I see you doing is you're methodically focusing on catching people doing something right or doing something well. And then you're shining a light on it for everybody else. But you're focusing on, I think you mentioned that you're putting people in there who close the deal, which is a result, an outcome. But you're also putting people in there who exhibited the behaviors and attitude that's important and that meets the culture of your team, right? Because you can control your inputs, right? Like what you did at the booth, or you got a certain number of demos or responded to this objection well, right? Like that's awesome. And the third thing, Jim, that I picked up on is that you have a big tent. It's inclusive. You're bringing the entire team in, right? This isn't just salespeople getting it done. Any good salesperson will say at that President's Club trip that I'm here because of my sales engineer, my manager, our marketing team, my SDR, right? And so all of those folks, you're getting, shining a light on what they're doing as well and bringing the team together. Would that be fair?
100%. We have a value set within Sysdig that's really built around three themes. It's being customer obsessed, digging deep, think grit, and then trusting in the team. Now, we build, our teams to embody that. And by putting a spotlight on the behavior of individuals that came together from different departments to progress a deal and to close it, it just reinforces that we're living up to the expectations that we set around building the team. And that's really the goal, as you put it, of being inclusive, because what we tend to say within Sysdig is it takes a village. And the village is the team that eventually gets recognized for those behaviors and activities that eventually led to that outcome. And that's, I think you're spot on in that comment. That's exactly what I'm trying to do with those weekly blogs.
Do you ever find that some people, when they're maybe new to your team, they're reluctant to share the success, meaning they almost think they have to do it themselves, that's required?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly those individuals that love to run, solo, and they like the ability to move fast and not have, dependencies that slow them down. But by constantly reinforcing, the benefits of collaborating, as an example, bringing in the business value team. Most organizations, especially in the Valley, they tend to be very strongly biased in enablement towards the marketing for the product. And as a result, that tends to consume, its unfair share, and you get into this feature functionality battle. If you're not careful, then you get driven down to a cost negotiation. Now, what I like to do is constantly highlight the fact that if you can connect the dots between a requirement, the business driver behind that requirement, and how we are going to enable the company to get from where they are today to where they want to be, you certainly have to match, the features with the capabilities that they need. But you need to wrap it around a blanket of how does this impact the business, whether it's through driving top line, cutting cost, improving customer satisfaction. Yeah. And that's part of why we constantly recognize these cross-functional teams, because they all play an integral role. But a lot of those individual contributors who have the tunnels up and who don't bring in their partners, they tend not to have the same success when it comes to conversions.
Yeah. No, thanks for sharing that. And so, Jim, we talked about inspirational leadership, and then the other side of that coin was accountability. And that's a hot topic in my circles here with Coach2Scale and on this podcast. And it's one of the questions that I'd say the last decade, going around the world, working with B2B SaaS companies, asking managers, asking leaders, what you struggle with and why. One of the top two answers is leaders say they struggle with holding people accountable. But you mentioned that almost, I don't want to say, you didn't call it a superpower, but you mentioned that as one of the two areas on which you like to focus. Mm-hmm. How do you do it?
Boy, this is a fascinating one. I'm in full agreement with you on that front. And I'll give you an example of a discussion that we had about 2 months ago on this topic, because enablement is probably one of the most underrated critical functions in any selling organization. And what we discovered is that we had a fair amount of content. That's an understatement. We were flooding the field with content from MindTickle. And it wasn't necessarily helping to raise the competitiveness of the business. So we made a decision to go back one quarter in Q3 to live training sessions that we supported that were time zone friendly for folks in Europe and Asia, We brought product management, product marketing onto the calls. We supported Q&A. And here's the accountability side of the equation. When you leave those training sessions, you're always questioning whether or not the message landed and whether or not the enablement was changing a behavior downstream. Because a lot of selling motions take place outside of the purview of a people leader, because people are out there every day doing their outreach sequences, using Sales Navigator, making phone calls, texting, and you don't really get a chance to listen in to see how they're selling. Now, fortunately, we have tools. One of them is Gong. And Gong has an amazing ability to not only summarize conversations, but to show how much time a sales rep spends listening versus talking. And now here's the fascinating thing that we discovered recently. You can also go deeper with Gong, and you can manage and track how well sales reps are asking the qualifying questions that we agreed as a team you needed to ask in order to develop a compelling point of view. And so what we've been able to do with the dashboards and Gong, and this has become a great coaching tool for the people leaders, is you can say, look, this rep is consistently asking only 2 of the 5 questions that we need to understand when we're selling into a customer's environment that has a very deep tech stack. Now, let me just pause there, because as a people leader, there are so many things that get put on the shoulders of sales leaders. They've got to make sure the entire business is running. It's arguably the hardest job in the business.
100%.
And if you're asking a people leader to coach up a rep, they can't be on every call, but what they can do is they can pull up a Gong, dashboard, and they can sit down with the sales rep and say, look, we all agreed that in order for us to have a higher propensity to win a deal, we needed to understand these 5 elements of the customer's tech stack. In the last 3 Gong recordings with prospects, when you're doing a disco, you only got to 2 or 3 out of those 5 questions. So I think it's an opportunity for you to get better by improving how you qualify. So it might, this is the adage, you have to inspect what you expect. And the way that we're validating training now, you can't wait until you see the win-loss rates,
right?
Because that could take months. But what you can do is immediately following a Gong call is you can look at the transcript, you can look at the dashboard, and you can identify where someone is not doing what you expect them to do.
Okay, so let's bring accountability up a layer to the manager.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not saying it's probably not the case with your team, but what I've observed, generally speaking, for a variety of reasons, managers aren't listening to the Gong calls, right? There's a lot of pressures on their time, yada, yada, yada. But how do you hold management, like a manager, accountable to actually going and listening to the requisite number of calls so he or she could have those conversations like you just mentioned?
Yeah, it's a spot on question. And one of the metrics that we inspect and track and report on are activities. The good news about Clary, and we're tied in, we're a Google shop. So our G Suite is tied to Clary. And we have the ability to look at the number of email traffic that goes back and forth between our sales reps and clients. We also can look at the amount of calls that take place. And when we see activity levels that are subpar, then on those, weekly manager reviews, we can take a look at the dashboard. It's really a large table, and we can recognize and promote those individuals at the top of the board, and we can ask some hard questions about the folks at the bottom and question why those activities are not translating into later stage ops. And it's not surprising is when you have a stack rank, which we do, we can monitor and track the amount of activity with our install-based customers as well as prospects. This is another challenge we all have in a hybrid, territory. You've got to be able to service existing customers, but you also need to be able to prospect. So we can look at both of those side by side. And 9 times out of 10, the individuals who are driving the activity with customers and prospects are also the ones that have the most POVs. And they also tend to have, a place in the top quartile of the leaderboard. And when you show that comparison, it's all data driven with a people leader. And then you look at the individuals that are at the bottom of the stack that are on their team. It's a very straightforward conversation. Like, what are you doing to change the outcome here? Because we've gone through all the enablement. Something is not working.
When you look at all that data,
Yeah.
If you were to come in blind, knowing what you know about the systems, and you looked at that data, can you, by looking at the rep data, can you tell who the top people leaders are?
The people leaders wouldn't show up in that dashboard.
No, but their people would. So I guess my question is, by looking, if you had an org chart and you knew who worked for whom, is there a cluster of people that work, let's say, for one people leader in the top quadrant? Do you tend to see that, or is it pretty much evenly?
It's pretty evenly, I think, allocated across people leaders, or at least the top performers are. Our business has about 47 reps globally and about 20, SEs. So we have somewhat of an intimate organization. The scale is not overwhelming to the point where I don't have a pulse for who the top performers are within each region. So it's fairly easy to look at that. We also look at attainment data on a quarterly basis. And when those graphics pop up, when you get a chance to step back after the dust of the quarter is settled, then it becomes pretty apparent, who's overweighted with people that are above plan versus those that have people that are at the bottom end of the stack ranks, meaning less than 50% attainment through a year-to-date number.
Jim, can you talk about a people leader that has impressed you a lot fairly recently? You don't have to name their name or anything like that, but what is something a people leader has done where you were like, wow.
Yeah, no,
very
fascinating. Cool. So we've got a people leader in our business who joined the team. We ended up replacing the former individual who was in the role. And so this individual came in and he had to inherit, an existing team. The team wasn't, they were in the bottom of the quartile rankings across the 6 regions in the country. So you could submit that this was a losing team because they were at the bottom of the stack ranks. Yeah. What I noticed was in that first, quarterly business review, he opened up, he went off the template. We have a template to make sure that everybody knows what they're expected to do in preparation for a review. And that template is, we'll call it a guiding principle for how we'll run the reviews at the rep level. But he probably had 3 or 4 slides that were dedicated to the concept of having a winning mindset. And he was able to bring in stories. It might have been a sports analogy. It could have been, we'll call it a motivational story about an individual or a team. And what he did was fuel inject this concept of winning for front and center before we got into the nuts and bolts of the business. And it goes back to that comment I made earlier in the discussion today about, ordinary people doing extraordinary things. And what he effectively did by talking about winners was make the team feel confident that we had the ability, because a lot of the stories that you love telling are about the underdogs who overcame insurmountable odds to accomplish remarkable things. And when you put those stories front and center in front of a team, especially a team that hasn't had the win rates or the track record, it helps them to appreciate that it is possible to accomplish great things. You just need to execute against the basics.
Yeah. Break it down, shrink the change. impossible is nothing. Focus on winning. We had a guest not too long ago, JD Silion, and he talked about the importance of building that winning mindset like you're talking about here versus that culture of, what do you call it? Culture of happy losers. Hey, everybody gets a trophy. Good job, you tried. But it's kind of in the middle there. It's not just about that. So I love the story that you shared about that individual's focus, going off the menu a little bit with the deck, but focusing on winning mindset. Super powerful. Jim, what's a painful lesson in this crazy business that you've learned over the years that's helped shape who you are and how you go about doing your business?
Boy, one of them ties to the fact that, like many of your listeners, I work for a private company that doesn't have the branding in the market that gets you into some of the at-bats that you're hoping for. And what I tried to impress upon the team when I joined is the fact that when we do get to the table, we're usually out-resourced, out-branded. We don't have a supply chain agreement in place, and that's going to create its own set of impediments that we have to overcome. Not that the prospect is referencing the fact that alternative providers have those advantages, but we're going into each of those at bats behind the eight ball, which means that we have to execute flawlessly in order to convince that customer that it's worth placing a bet on someone that perhaps doesn't show up in a magic quadrant, who doesn't have the branding. And that means we've got to be excellent at how we assign our territories at the manager level, how we establish the ICP, and then how we prospect in a way that allows us to provide a point of view, which gives us the ability, right, to earn the right to ask qualifying questions. And if we're not excellent at all of those motions that go into creating and converting pipe, the natural bias is to stick with an incumbent or a more well-known provider. And we have to overcome all of those considerations by being great at what we do.
What do you say to that salesperson who says, we almost won that deal, but we lost to a competitor who out-resourced us and out-branded us, and they just went with a better name? What do you say to that salesperson?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly a complicated question because there's it depends there. I would submit that in some cases, the table is set before we arrive. And that puts the onus on us to try to shape requirements. But when we do, deal with a loss to a better branded competitor, the first thing I highlight is the fact that, look, we're a $100 million business, and there's people to your left and your right who are figuring out how to beat those same competitors on a daily basis. Have you talked to any of your peers outside of your immediate team?
Yeah, it's good.
And this is something that a lot of, I would say, sales reps don't do as often as they should. Because if you're on a team of 8 people, you tend to be somewhat, I would say, myopic in terms of your visibility. Yeah. But, reach out to someone who works on the East Coast if you're on the West Coast, or reach out to someone in Europe that has competed and won against the people that you're currently up against, and then get a feel for what they've done differently to set traps or to highlight, what I call our superpowers are to give us a better chance of winning.
Yeah, that's awesome. I was thinking of this story, and I stole this from somebody else, or this person shared a story with me where in their CRM, they had if you lost a deal, and it would say like why. Well, that one was already filled in. It's you lost because you got outsold. And then the question was, well, why did you get outsold? And then it had a list of values. But it was just the mindset was you didn't lose because you were outbranded or because you were out-resourced. You lost because you got outsold. And then now let's figure out why you got outsold, because we can work on that. So a little harsh maybe for some, but I kind of thought it was funny.
No, it's provocative, and it forces people to think hard. You can't just point the finger and say, well, they went with the incumbent, or we didn't have this feature. it's easy to fall or use that as a crutch.
Yeah. Call it the corporate salute this way. So, Jim, you're at Sysdig now. You've been there for almost 3 years, a little over 2.5, 3 years, right? For those who don't know, what does Sysdig do, and what do you love about working with your team?
Great. So Sysdig is a private company based in San Francisco. We're venture backed. We are a leader in the CNAP category because in cybersecurity, you can't have enough acronyms. So Gartner came up with one about a year and a half ago called Cloud Native Application Protection, CNAP. And as one of the leaders in that space, what we do is provide cloud and container security for enterprises. So we're primarily an enterprise selling motion. What I do love about the business is the culture. I've often told people that have interviewed for roles at the company that the three guiding principles that brought me to Sysdig were: one, culture, number one; two, having a product that had category leadership in its specific use case; and three, being in a market that was large and growing exponentially. The culture of the business, having been at other big high-tech selling firms, you see leaders who you want to emulate, and then you see other leaders who you would prefer never to work with again. And what I discovered at Sysdig is from, the CEO down, it's really a culture of individuals that work super hard. They have the shared vision thing down, but they also support each other. And we refer to the village on every single closed won deal because we're bringing in the kitchen sink. In many cases, you need that to tip the scales in your favor when you don't have the branding. And I would say the culture is one of the reasons that brought me to the business. And it's one of the things that keeps people, in the business today, because in my opinion, people are a differentiator. And I believe that gets overlooked when you pull up your competitive playbooks and you're trying to figure out how to set traps. Customers want to partner with people. And, every SaaS business out there has a jump ball every year if you're on an annual contract. So as an AE, in the old days, you could sell something and then move on. In this SaaS world, you've got to sell something. You've got to make sure it gets deployed. Then you have to, validate, are they getting the value?
Yeah.
That doesn't come unless you've got a customer success engineer on the back end who's, doing all the things that they do to keep customers delighted. You've got a business value partner that comes in and says, look, we promised we would do X. Here's what we're actually doing. Now let's get in front of the customer and say, hey, here are the metrics that you told us that you cared about. Here's how we're doing. How do you think we're progressing? And so you have this customer facing deck, not just how you consumed and deployed the technology, but are we impacting the business the way that we promised we would?
Yeah. And that last part that you just brought up, Jim, seems to be a huge struggle for a lot of companies. And I don't know, I don't know if it's just coincidental on the timing, but post-COVID, customer sat seems to have gone down the toilet in many areas. And, I could sit here and wax poetically about why I think that is, but my observation, and it's not just in the world that we're living in and working in, it's when you are home trying to find a vendor, try to find someone to do something for your house. It's become incredibly difficult. And so the focus, I think you said it was the number one focus for Sysdig, which is customer success and making sure. Right. Yeah. So that's super, super huge. Jim, we're the Coach2Scale podcast. We talk about coaching. We bring on guests like yourself that have an interesting point of view that I mentioned before, had a lot of success, but also have stubbed their toe along the way and are willing to talk about it because they live to talk about it. It's about people who care about the coaching and development of others. So with that, what we find is people who care about coaching and developing people who care about leading people, have had that behavior modeled for them somewhere along the way. Can you talk about someone whose coaching in your life has had a big and positive impact on you?
Yeah, one of my early people leaders, when I started in the data infrastructure space, challenged me as I got bumped up into a leadership role. And the question that he posed was, what is the leadership shadow that you're going to leave on your team? And I thought that that was a provocative and fascinating question, because in the next 10 months, I went out to an expat assignment in Asia. So I was based out of Tokyo, Japan. And I went out there because, I had the experience selling into the financial service markets in Wall Street. There was a big financial service and telco vertical in our Tokyo office. And my job was to improve performance. And I went out there with the mindset that, I needed to focus on getting the right people on the bus. And for those that weren't a good fit, to have those candid conversations. Culturally, it's not easy to performance manage individuals out of certain regions of the world. This was one of them.
I bet.
But once we got beyond that, I really made decisions based upon what would happen when I leave. Would there be a repeatable, scalable process that the next team could adopt and drive to keep the performance numbers going up and to the right? I was fortunate that when I left, we inverted the depth chart. We had more people above plan than below plan. And, the two people leaders that were under me, they had 4 or 5 like core operating principles that became the foundation for when they picked up where I left off.
Mm-hmm.
And, it's interesting. For years afterwards, we stayed in touch, even though we changed companies, and we still will message each other because it's a small world. And one of them came back and said, hey, I really appreciated the energy that you put into getting these operating principles cemented deep in the ground, because it helped with their career progression. So that concept of, we all cast a leadership shadow. What is the shadow that you're going to leave behind for your team? That was one that stuck with me, and it's been on my journey for the last 20 years.
Love it. I have to ask you a couple of questions about your assignment in Japan, because a lot of people come on to this show and they talk about a gap that they have in their career, and it's leading teams internationally. And so if I had to pick the top couple of where it would be the most difficult, I would say Japan. I'd probably name up there. I've never led a team in Japan. I've never worked in Japan, but I'm just guessing.
Yeah.
And so do you speak Japanese?
Nihongo ga skoshi wakarimasu.
I'm going to assume that means yes.
I speak very little Japanese.
Okay. And then how important was it to make sure you understand the culture? I've had friends and colleagues who have made just quick business trips to Japan, and they were all sweating bullets about culturally it's so seemingly so different than the US that they wanted to make sure that they didn't screw it up. Is that a real thing?
100%. And I'll tell you a funny story.
Awesome.
Right. So I went out to Japan and I read, a book on what's culturally appropriate, what's not. And then you get on the ground, and I made sure I talked to all of my team about what's the right way to meet prospects and customers. And in Japan, the business card is valued, right? It's very important that when you meet, you line up in order of your seniority, and there's 2 lines facing each other. You hold the card with reverence and you present it, and then your we'll call it customer reads the card, they nod their head, you bow, and then you take your place on the table. And if you were across the table from me, your business card would be placed on the table right in front of you. And then if your partner was on your left, I would put the business card. So surrounding my notebook would be business cards of all the customers that were at the table. Those business cards at the end of a meeting would be carefully placed into a business card holder that would go in the breast pocket of your suit coat, because this was all, blue conservative suits, white shirts, blue ties. Well, someone told me the story about what not to do because they had someone from my company who happened to come from Texas. And about a year beforehand, they brought this executive out to meet with a bunch of customers. And he's like, we don't need to do all this formality. I'm from Texas, and in Texas, we're just very direct and candid. Let's all just sit down. And it was inappropriate to not go through the process of exchanging business cards. But all of the customers, gave their business cards to the translator. Translator gave them to, this former colleague. And he took them, and instead of placing them on the table next to their counterparts, he put them in his back pocket. All right. So he's already committed 2 or 3 faux pas, but it's not over yet.
Oh,
the meeting is done. Everyone goes out to dinner, and they're out at one of these restaurants where you're on tatami mats and you're sitting, you're kneeling at a table, and the sake is out and all the food is out. At some point during the meal, he gets a piece of food stuck in his teeth. What do you think he does? He reaches into his back pocket. He pulls out.
It's not enough that he stuck the business cards up his ass, basically. Then he pulls them out and he starts cleaning his teeth with them.
100%. And so someone told me that story, and they said, Jim-san, as long as you don't do that, you'll be fine.
Can't fall off the floor, man. That's
no. So yeah, the cultural paradigm is incredibly important, and you need to understand it and honor it wherever you travel.
I love it. And maybe it's just because I'm an only child, self-centered. I love hearing stories. I got to figure out a way to draw these stories out of guests. Like, what's a crazy story from your career? Like, that's a funny one. I love that.
Yeah, we should start with that next time.
Exactly. Who's your favorite coach? Broad, big picture, name a lot of people would know. It doesn't have to be sports, but whatever. Who's your favorite coach, and what attributes do you admire or respect about that person?
I might go in a different direction slightly because I'm a big fan of sports. We're all competitive. I watched a reel by Roger Federer about 2 weeks ago, and I sent the reel out to the team as part of my weekly notes about mindset. And, Federer, he's done 20 Grand Slams. He's won 103 ATP titles. In this reel, he goes on to talk about the fact that even though he's accomplished all of these things in his life, when he looked back over all of his matches, he only won 54% of the points. Let that sink in. So in any tennis match, there's a number of points that they're competing for. He only won a little more than half, yet he won the most important ones, which gave him the 20 Grand Slams and the 103 titles. And so the message that he was delivering was, it's these small nuances that make the difference between those who are at the top of the leaderboard and those who are in the middle and those who are at the bottom. So don't give up when you run into obstacles, because those are there on the way to winning. And I know that your question was built around like your favorite coach. I looked at that comment from Roger Federer as one that every individual contributor, every manager could take to heart, because if you play the long game, you're going to run into speed bumps. Yeah. And you have to accept the fact that they are going to happen regardless of what you try to do to operate around it. You just have to be excellent at what you do to win more than half of those points.
That's amazing. And there's a saying out there, you don't win or lose by a lot. You win or lose by a little. Like the margins in sports or in our business are really razor thin. And what it takes to get to that level, to be able to execute when it actually counts, is super, super important. So I love that story about Roger Federer. I'm going to share one back, if that's okay.
Sure. Love it.
It impressed me so much. It spoke to me so much. I actually took some time to write about it. I put something out on LinkedIn, I think yesterday, and it was UFC John Jones, and John Jones was fighting for the heavyweight championship. I'm not a big, I don't know a lot about UFC. I really like it, but I don't know all the names. But
Yeah.
I was watching a reel, an interview, and he's talking about how he won the fight. And as he's talking, it's showing the way he ended the fight to win. And he ended it with what's called a spinning back kick. And what caught my attention on this interview was that, number one, he said, I would like to thank this is a post-game interview, I would like to thank my coaches. And he names like 5 of them. And he says, but those are my strength coaches. What I'd really like to do is call out my Taekwondo coach, blah, blah, blah. And he gives the guy's name and where his dojo was and, all that. Dojang, Taekwondo. And then he talks about how this coach worked with him 3 times a week, 1 hour a day for 6 months, 3 hours a week, for 6 months on one kick. And he called out a famous Bruce Lee quote. I'm going to paraphrase it. I fear not the person who knows 1,000 kicks. I fear the person who has one kick and practiced it 1,000 times.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, you throw this kick once in a fight. Like people apparently don't throw spinning back kicks more than, once in a fight, because then you kind of see it coming. And he's like, so you got one chance, and 3 hours a week for 6 months to throw one kick one time, and you got to hit it. And if you hit it, it's all over. And I just thought, like, man, imagine if as salespeople we spent that kind of time on one aspect of the sales call, one aspect of the sales cycle. I thought that was pretty cool. Kind of Roger Federer-like.
It's fascinating, right? Because you need things to be muscle twitch, and I think that story speaks volumes about what happens, what's it called? Purposeful training.
Yep.
And you just do something over and over again until you have it down pat. And I think there's a lot of lessons to be taken out of that to the broader community out there.
Well, Roger Federer, John Jones, we'll end there, Jim. We covered a lot of ground. We talked about casting a leadership shadow. We learned what the acronym CNAP was. Awesome. We talked about how it's important to think like a goat, shine the light on people who are doing the right behaviors and activities. Just really, really awesome conversation. I appreciate the energy and the perspective you brought to the conversation. So thank you, Jim.
Hey, I'm grateful that you had me on today, and appreciate all the winners out there who are listening to this, because we're all trying to do the same thing, is get incrementally better.
That's right. A little bit better every day. Kaizen, that's a Japanese term, isn't it? If I'm probably not saying it right, but
it is.
Anyway, on that note, thanks again, Jim. And for everybody out there, thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. Let us know what you liked. Engage with us on social media. Also, let us know where you disagree. But also let us know what you'd like to hear more about, guests that you'd like to see. We want to bring content to you that helps make that tough job that you have just a little bit easier. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. And until next time, coach them if you want to keep them. We hope you've enjoyed this episode of Coach2Scale, How Modern Leaders Build Coaching Cultures. For show notes and other episodes, visit us at coachem.io. That's COACHEM.io. And follow us on Twitter at CoachemNow. See you all next week. Thanks for joining. And remember, coach them if you want to keep them.